So first, I want to introduce you, Brooking. I should have written a clever bio, but I actually didn't.
It's more fun this
But yeah,
way.
so our guest today is my good friend Brooking. She's a poet. She's creative in ways far beyond poetry as well. She it has recently, well, I guess not so recently now, but moved from LA, sadly for me, but good for her. And she's going to school for poetry now. And Brooking, the first question actually that I wanted to ask you was is about poetry, because I know that you gave that TED talk about this topic, and I want to just hear kind of your present view on this. But what does it mean to listen like a poet?
That's kind of a fun one. Because, yeah, that was 5 years ago. And at the time, that talk was like the culmination of my 10 years or so of spiritual practice and reignited relationship with poetry. And so in that period of my life, when I was really into meditation and sort of breaking free of some of the conditioned consciousness, I also kind of got retapped by the muse of poetry and entered into this different kind of relationship with it that was kind of mystical.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the whole thing. And it is evolving. But at the time, the sense was to relate with the self as poet was like this hall pass into being in conversation with the world and to be in direct relationship with even what we think of as inanimate.
Yeah.
And to sort of like listen for the aliveness and the messages and everything, because I was a poet,
Right.
But it was really just this excuse to like get the backstage pass or something
Yeah.
to the world,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's kind of where it came from and what I talk about in that TED Talk.
Yeah. So you feel like your spiritual exploration leading up to that and some of the spiritual practices you were doing kind of like gave you a new view of what poetry could be or what poetry could do?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's interesting to have this conversation right now too, because yeah, like I was super into it in high school and like studied the form and the meter and like the greats, and then I feel like I had a couple of tastes when I was younger of I know we've talked about this before, but is this the same audience or should I just say things over again?
I don't think that we recorded some of the stuff we talked about with your, the first vow you took in high school and all that.
Okay, so that story.
Yeah, you can tell that story or anything,
Yeah.
related to that.
Yeah. So anyway, in high school, I started having these, I guess you could say in retrospect, kind of mystical experiences of like, I'd be sitting in math class and all of a sudden it was just like I was in a different reality. I was in this deeper cut of timeless time. And it was like it was a different world of beings.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the kids in the classroom. It was like these souls. And I don't know how to describe this, but it's almost like if it was a movie, this scene would cut from the classroom to an old castle.
Right.
And you're like, there's a great Leonard Cohen song where he talks about the Tower of Song. And, and he sort of paints this metaphor of there's this multi-hundred story tower of the artists who have managed to do something while alive that lasted beyond their death. And then he says, I asked Hank Williams, how lonely does it get? Hank Williams hasn't answered yet, but I hear him coughing all night long, 100 floors above me in the Tower of Song.
Ooh. Wow.
Yeah. So it felt like I just like went into that world for a second. And there was this Rilke who vibe, and I didn't even know him that well at the time. And this poem came through me. And it was way better than something like 14-year-old Brooking could have written. It was
Right.
like, felt like I was channeling something, and I knew it. There was like a vibration. I was like, this is it. And then from then on, everything else I wrote that was like Brooking's life story just felt
Mm-hmm.
like so stupid.
Mm.
So I stopped writing for a really long time. And then it kind of felt like that muse came back a little bit, and I started writing again. And then, so a lot of my early writing was kind of only this weird spiritual transmission kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then I've been learning about how to incorporate like the personal, visceral, political.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I don't know the answer yet, but those are the questions I'm in now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's incredible. I can just like visualize the land of the muses or something that you tapped into when you were a teenager. And it's almost like the imaginal realm. People talk about the imaginal realm where it's like, I don't know, it seems like it's half imaginary but half real at the same time. And
I
like,
think it's the soul realm,
yeah,
you
okay.
know? Like, I think it's the parts of us, because sometimes I feel it when I'm awake, and I felt this with you, people that you have some sort of connection about something beyond like who you are as a person right now in this lifetime.
Yeah.
And so it's like those kinds of relationships with yourself or with others opens you into this other space, and
So
yeah.
tapping into that space at that time in like math class or at that time in your life, was it during math class when you had that like revelation? Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that moment happened in the math class, and I started writing the poem in class.
Yeah.
And then the bell rang, and I was
Mm-hmm.
in this altered state. It was like I was on a mushroom trip, and nobody else was. They were just all caffeinated, and everybody's like buzzing through the halls. And I felt like I was this like bigger, heavier being, and my feet were 6 feet under the ground. And I was just almost like a ghost
Mm.
traveling among them, and just completely in it. It was like a different part of self, a different locus of identity.
I can only imagine that, um, like kind of accessing that. Then, do you feel like you ever shook that off at all, or did it kind of hang with you to this day? And
It's yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, because I think as humans, in a way, it's this game of you remember and then you forget, and then you
yeah,
remember and then you forget, until even when you're forgetting, you're still remembering. Like,
right,
I don't know. I think
right,
that that's the game. So, in a way, I forgot about that for a long time, and I associated it with poetry. So it wasn't until 15 plus years later that I could frame that as a spiritual experience. At the
right.
time, it was like I was inside of the emotional space. So I just felt it as being called to be a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that class, I walked outside, and I was in this weird sort of trance state.
Yeah.
And I went, and that's the one time when I walked and looked up at the sky and made this vow with the energies that be in this
Mm-hmm.
larger reality that had suddenly opened up to me, that I vowed to not lose touch with the flame.
Yeah.
So it was like, and there's this great Neruda poem that I think speaks to it really well, where he says, and something ignited in my soul, a fever or unremembered wings. And I finished the first line, bare, pure foolishness of one who knows nothing.
Mm.
And suddenly the heavens unfastened and opened.
Unfastened. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, I think that's the thing. Like, it's almost like that moment that, as an artist or whatever the call, it's almost like you unzip this new world that
The veil. You take down the
it's
veil.
like a trade. You're committing the responsibility of whatever your role is there. Poet's
Right.
sort of responsible for note taking.
Yeah.
And in exchange, you get access to this incredible world of whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. No, I like your idea about, framing like being a poet as kind of an excuse to engage with the world in a specific way. And it's almost like a magical act, like magic in the sense of like using your intentions to kind of transform your reality.
Mhm.
And
Some say it's casting spells.
exactly, yeah, it's that sort of thing. And so that's really exciting to me. I think in my own way, I do the same thing with my um role, just thinking of myself as a poet, but not quite in the in I
Well,
never thought about it quite like that
I
until you
mean,
brought it up. So
it's
that's
funny though, because when I think about your poetry, it very much feels like I often think of the poet's a note taker. I mean, that's your job. You're just like in the room, like describing what's going on, you know?
yeah.
And what gets described inside of your poems feels like really clear depiction of some of those imaginal realms, you know?
Oh yeah.
And there's always like, it's not the 3D consensus world that's happening inside your poems. Like you move back and forth in time and space and
Right.
things that don't go together so much that it has that sort of funhouse, cosmic funhouse feel, you know?
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I'm walking around the world, I think I used to maybe look at everything through the lens of a poet. And I'm sure I do still like subconsciously, but yeah, when I sit down to actually write, the act of writing, I'm definitely usually accessing that kind of what's
Yeah.
beyond the veil.
Yeah, that's a good point because I think you just touched on something about your original question of like, well, what's changed in the however many years, you know? And you said I used to look around the world like a poet. And it
Mhm.
what I think I hear you saying is, but now what I do is I sit at the desk and like the whole world is available, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, both of them, like, I think I would probably prefer to always walk around as a poet. But at the very least, it's nice that I can still sit down and tap into that realm
Hmm.
regardless. I think I probably walk around the world looking at the world more like a philosopher than a poet these days,
That
or
makes
maybe mystic, um, philosopher, mystic, poet. But they
well,
all,
that's the thing. Are they really that different, you know?
no, they're really not.
And that's part of why like I feel like a weirdo in the MFA a lot of the time, you know, like
Yeah.
I write crazy shit. Most people are like, the fuck is this? Like we had to do a sonnet last week, and you know, sonnets are traditionally love poems, and I was like, really like, okay, something about uncommon love. And I'm putzing with it. And then I'd recently watched this like 8-hour series of talks between John Vervaeke and Bernardo Kastrup, who are like eminent philosophers that disagree over whether matter begets mind or mind begets matter is the
Right.
basic argument. So I was like really deep into that. And I kept that kind of shit shows up in my poems. And, you know, it's like I had this poem and the first line was, there's a mind of God greater than galaxies,
Mm.
you know? And it's just like, well, that's rich. So I'd written this crazy poem about that was super cryptic. And then I was like, maybe I'll revisit that idea for this sonnet. So I wrote this sonnet to that was all about the sort of philosophical and spiritual things that I think about and grapple with, but in the like traditional romantic style sonnet form.
Yeah.
And it kind of worked. It was kind of interesting.
Nice.
Like, oh, like
Yeah, no, it's very interesting how that stuff starts bleeding into your and into poems, like because I do the same thing. I'll binge watch videos that are super deep about some philosophical or cosmic topic, and it's bound to start spilling into your poetry, and
it's
it's
like an energy or a shape or something,
right.
like a dance move that you got to find a way to fit into the writing.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting bridge bringing that up because I have a couple questions that are related to mind and God and consciousness. One specific question is, and maybe you'll resonate with this question, maybe not, and if we'll just see where it goes. But do you think that there is an element of consciousness that is not conditioned?
I mean, yes. And I'm finding myself curious about not conditioned
Hmm.
as opposed to there's so many different ways that gets languaged. Um, I've often heard it talk about as bound versus unbound.
Yeah.
Um, And then, yeah, my favorite language for it is awake awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I do think, and I know that that is real.
Mm-hmm. Awake awareness. I like that.
Yeah, and it's sort of an infinite resource we can tap into to help free the other parts of ourselves.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. I like unbounded too. That's nice. I know Buddhists often use that word. Yeah, the unboundedness of it. And your last point, I think, is really important because it's easy to just, well, it's easy for me to just like get lost in kind of the ideas of it, but the practical impact that it can have to be so healing, because it can, since it is unbounded, it kind of allows you to heal some of the bounded parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm. And just get a little space, you know.
Exactly.
There's
It's
a
very spacious.
there's a certain physics to healing, where, you know, you could call it, uh again, language, the unbounded, the awake awareness, that field of pure potentiality,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
the, you know, infinite highest dimensions or lowest dimensions or whatever, you know,
mm-hmm.
the thing that contains it all. We can train our awareness to tap into that in various ways, various kinds of meditation, just training your own ability to track and state shift.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes a resource. And then once, like, what a healer is doing is centering their awareness in that place, and then bringing awareness and attention to the places that are bound, either in themselves or the person they're working with. And then as soon as that happens, it's like an osmosis, you know,
Yeah.
energy goes from high to low. And once that connection is made between the bound and unconscious energy and the infinite awake awareness, it naturally moves
Yeah.
and it just releases
Yeah.
into the all again. And so, like, yeah, we can do practices to open up the system, you know.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. I, I go through phases where a certain word or phrase or idea is kind of the thing that like is resonating the most. And I went through several months where just the notion of stillness is what I could use to experientially kind of rest in that infinite spaciousness. And like I can, I mean, I can kind of do it right now where it's, you can just feel the stillness that pervades everything. And so, yeah, whatever hacks you can use to get there are really nice. And in some ways, just to reference poetry for a second again, I mean, I think that it's not the same exact thing that I tap into with poetry, but it is a certain unboundedness. It's like you can tap into a certain type of unboundedness that, in the same way that you were talking about healing, you bring that unboundedness into the unconscious or what's bounded. You can do the same thing with language and poetry. Like you're taking, you know, from that realm that you talked about earlier and kind of shining that onto the mundane. And
Yeah.
then the mundane kind of opens up in a way that it didn't before.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
you
feel like a
mentioned,
lot of my poetry is really just doing that.
yeah,
It's like
that's great.
weaving these weird little bridges between that sort of archetypal realm and the material presence.
Right.
And I notice for a lot of readers, they don't know what to do with that.
Mm,
Just like, what is this poem doing? What's the storyline? And I'm like, who are the characters? And I'm like, and so that's something I'm grappling with, is like, how much do I have to do that versus letting it be a weird mystical poem about a woman drawing water from a well, you know?
yeah, that's a lifelong experiment. I mean, you know how my poetry is. If people like, yeah, it doesn't necessarily fit into certain expectations that a lot of people have, and it's fine with me, but yeah, it becomes kind of something that you have to negotiate with it with yourself.
Mhm.
But you mentioned spiritual practice a couple of times. I know last time we talked, I think that you had a pretty steady zazen practice. Is that still going on?
No.
Okay, cool.
I totally fell off the Zazen wagon. Yeah, I
Do
have
you-
a board. I call it the grid. I keep it on my fridge, and it's got all my practices that I like to do, but I don't do very well with discipline. So the system works well for me. So there's like zazen, and there's taking walks. There's more than walks, as in more exercise. And then I have subtle body time, which could be like yoga, qigong, dancing.
Mhm.
And then I have reading, writing, eating well, and wild time, I call it. And that's like going to the river or sex or like taking a shower and getting like into that mythic consciousness that we're talking
Mhm.
about. And those are the things I track. So
I love that.
right now I'm doing really well on clean eating because I got sick and I had to get super focused on like physical health. So that kind of took over clean eating and wild time in some way, shape, or form, and walking. Those are my
Nice.
strengths the last few months.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I don't have a list written out quite like that, but I do have a similar toolbox of practices that I can choose.
Yeah, I just like it as a way to I guess reframe relationship with discipline,
Yeah,
and it's like I am committed to balance.
mm,
I am
me
committed
too.
to listening, and yeah, and there's different ebbs and flows with that.
Yes, absolutely.
I love my zazen, and I
How do
hope
you
it
feel
comes
like
back
zazen?
soon.
Yeah, yeah. I feel you. Whenever I've tried to have a steady zazen practice, it doesn't last super long. And to be honest, for better for worse, as far as meditation practice, I don't think zazen is the one that works for me the best.
Mm,
I try to bring it in I have like a 7-part meditation. Like whenever I sit down to meditate, I kind of created this 7-part thing where and one of those 7 is zazen. So
that's
there's like a
interesting.
portion of the
It's like
meditation
the
that's zazen.
7-minute workout, but a meditation version. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
intervals.
Yeah, so part of it's zazen, part of it's mantra, then part of it's a breathing thing, part
Mhm.
of it's a visualization thing, and part of it's a love and kindness thing. And like
Mhm.
all the types of meditation that I like the most, for a while I was like, oh, well, this day I'll do love and kindness, and this day I'll do zazen. And then it got to the point where I was like, no, I think it would be cool to kind of have a process where I sit down for like 20 minutes and I do the whole spectrum.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. I've been thinking about one of the reasons that I backed off of Zazen is my nervous system was having a freak out because I was going through I was dating and then and that's really, really hard on a not totally securely attached nervous system.
Yeah.
I was dealing with really intense physical sensation stuff.
Hmm.
And it's like Zazen. And I went to this attachment trauma workshop with this Qigong instructor I used to train with. And it was such a good reminder that there are other kinds of meditation that are soothing, and Zazen is just
Yeah.
about be with what is. That's it.
Hmm.
Just witness the beast.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, maybe I need to do the ones where it's like somatic, self-soothing. And so I kind of switched gears and started doing different practices for a while.
Well, like you said, you got to listen to what's most useful in the moment. And well, you mentioned walking, and I know we've talked about your connection with the river and stuff. And I wanted to ask you that a little bit, like, how and why how and why have you been continuously like drawn to the river?
Well, when I was a little girl, so I grew up in the suburbs, and there's a little bit of chaos in my house, and just what my mom was carrying lineage wise in her psyche and nervous system and emotional body. And so from a young age, my dad would take me out fishing because it's something that he loved to do. And so I always associated, and then, first we would go to the local pond when I was really little, and I learned how to catch bluegill with hot dogs, And then as I got a little older, I got to go out to the rivers and like fly fish with him. And he taught me to fly fish in the Merrimack River here in Missouri. And I don't know if you've seen the movie A River Runs Through It. Like there's a
It's been
certain
a long time.
poetry that's just so fundamentally ineffable about that love affair with river. And so, for me, from a very young age, it's like that's just this current that sort of like nourished my heart, and then when I was in college, I was along a bigger river and spent a lot of time with the Connecticut River up in New Hampshire and swam in the river and like walked by it all the time. And then I moved out to California, and it was a long period of drought, and it was this physical learning about being in relationship with landscape that doesn't have seasons and that where water is in sparse supply. And that was really hard for me because element wise, I'm not water. I'm like air and fire.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've learned through my little Odyssean journey of leaving home and coming back that I need the river. It's like medicine. It's just like part of my balance, and I need the earth here and the soft mud, and they help me be whole, is what I'm learning since I've been back. Because it's like I can relax into something outside myself. And like be in that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So and then I go and I sit by the river all the time. I try to go about once a week, and it's like just important to me. It's like visiting your grandma, you got to go and sit down and listen to her and her rocker for a while and, just be together.
I love that. Yeah. Grandma River.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. There's one thing that you've mentioned to me several times in the past that I always wanted to ask you more about. And for some reason I can't quite identify, like I don't know if you did this before or after you lived in the Bay Area, but energy school. You went to energy school, and like that's just so fascinating to me, and I'm curious about that. Like, what was it like, and what did you learn, and what do you carry with you from that time?
Oh my gosh, that's a big topic. A big part of what it was learning to train your awareness to move, to perceive in yourself and in the world, subtle energy, and to learn how to move it in a good way.
Yeah.
So that's really what it was in short.
Did they talk about like the chakras at all?
Yeah, we learned all sorts of different things. Man, I should find, I have a whole folder of handouts and stuff of these interesting images that they would make for us. So we learned like some psychology maps, child development psychology, and Hakomi based. And then it was rooted in this sort of Tibetan awareness practice, and the other schools of energy healing specifics. There was Meridian and Chinese medicine and Taoist Qigong elements and Taoist medicine. And there was some, not Ayurveda so much, but like the basic chakra idea. We learned some of the basic techniques that like inform Reiki, but then we went into way further territories than that.
Such an intricate blend.
Yeah. It's a pretty cool map. It's a pretty robust map. They spent years and years and years developing it. And the whole thing, the idea is the school itself is in conversation with the fields. So this sort of, I would say, feminine approach to relating with that. We were talking earlier about the sort of mythic realm. And then there's also what some call the morphogenetic field, when they're connected, but there's a certain living intelligence and like edge of evolution kind of state that people like to get in there and track and then ride the edge. It's almost like midwiving our own evolution. And so the whole program was really playing with that edge, and they would use the collective energy of the group as more and more people in the group got trained. And then the fields would be evolving from year to year. So they were kind of learning from the fields, as they would say,
Wow.
and translating that for the next
That's
class.
so cool.
So
That's
yeah,
so cool.
it's evolved since I've been there.
Yeah. Was there, I mean, like, you learned about all these maps that they had kind of constructed and you know, connected different maps together into one map. But was there a lot of practicing that you guys did, like
Yeah.
actual practice?
Yeah, absolutely. The way it worked is we did there was 8 modules, and each module was like a 4-day intensive
Hmm.
in the woods at these retreat centers with yurts.
Mm-hmm.
um and we would do those 4-day intensives, and then we would have a couple of months to integrate. So you'd be working on your own shit for each of the patterns that we learned to track and support the healing, see the wound and learn how to work with the wound,
Hmm.
and then you would do practice sessions on a modality that specifically supported that issue.
Hmm.
And then you would have to do like 10 sessions with other students and then you do a whole bunch of practice at the module. So by the time I was finished, I'd probably given like 150 healing practice sessions,
Wow.
in the process. And I used to do it a lot, you know,
Yeah. That's
but
incredible.
mhm.
Yeah, I mean, like you had always referenced that, and I know that some of the language that you use is connected to that.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's like, to me, it seems like such an interesting thing. And then every time I've brought it up to you in the past, you're kind of just like, oh yeah, I went to I went to energy school.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Um,
like it's such a conversation because it's this whole world of
right,
ways of thinking, perceiving, and talking that most people don't have a frame of reference for.
right,
So
right.
to describe it, I have to like build a lot of scaffolding.
Yeah, I understand.
But
Well,
in short, yeah, it was like learning to work with awareness for healing.
I love that. I know this is a complicated question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you believe in God? Why or why not?
Well, of course, it depends what is God to you. And so to me, God is an intelligence, higher intelligence, something that is greater than we are. And in that sense, it's both yes and no, because absolutely, like me as egoic um, human biology conditioned being, there's an intelligence far, far greater than me. And no ego really likes to hear that, but there's a certain beauty in that surrender. And, the Christian tradition is based in that one in its own way. And so are many traditions, this devotional path. But I think, as with all of these things, it's really like a Taurus or a yin yang, and they're interconnected and they beget each other. And so that truth and reality will bring you to the equally true other side of the duality, that like there is no separation possible. And so in that sense, I believe in isness, and I am isness, and God is isness, and there's no difference. And
Yeah.
so it's a non-verbalizable perspective in a way.
Right.
And I feel like, that's the paradox. They're both true.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more
Do
the
you
dual.
think that there's anything outside of God?
Is that the whole question?
Yeah.
um Ultimately, no.
Yeah.
But it's also fun to say yes. It's also fun to live yes.
Mm. What do you
um
mean by that?
Well, and it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like the unbounded state or the awake awareness state. It's like, ultimately, no, it's all undifferentiated. And at the same time, part of the magic of being human is to experience differentiation and also be able to experience undifferentiation, and to get to be on both of those rides, potentially even at the same time.
Yeah.
like have fun, like suffer, cry, like eat a
Yep.
really good piece of cake,
Yep. Absolutely.
like experience the death of people you love, all of it.
Yeah. Well, that's why, I mean, because I mean, if I'm going to use the word God, then to me there is nothing outside of God. There couldn't be. And so that almost encourages me more to embrace the differentiation, because the differentiation is God too. The piece of cake
Yeah.
is God, you know.
Yeah.
Um that's
That's a good
interesting
line of
because
poem.
it's that's cool that we're kind of landing here at the end, because I did a podcast with my friend Raymond, who you need to talk to him too. He's super cool, super smart. And we kind of landed in the same spot, because we were he and I were just kind of saying that a lot of spirituality really emphasizes oneness and unity, right? And like that's totally cool, and I think that that's important, because I think that it is all one, as cheesy as that sounds, it's true. It's all one interdependent web. um and at the same time, I think that sometimes if we just emphasize the oneness and the unity, then we kind of lose sight of the importance of what we were just saying, importance of multiplicity, differentiation, individuality. And so that's where I've been for a while, is like, I just going back to balance. I think it's just somehow finding a balance in our experience and in our view of things that incorporates both the the oneness and the differentiation. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's the game.
Yeah. And I think that poetry is a cool route to do that too, because you know it allows you to really, it's like the differentiation is sometimes what makes poetry so exciting, is like you're looking at all these very different things, and then you're looking at how they're all connected too. So
Can I read a poem on this topic?
yes, please. Yes,
Speaking
please.
of which,
Yes.
I don't know if I've shared this one or not. This is a river poem. I got
Cool.
this series I'm doing called Hymns of Watching the Waters.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Watch with me now, I say, dare to eat the lotus. Stay a while and you'll see it. The catfish rising amongst floating forage, the center of its mouth aimed round a hovering nymph, while the center of its mind does a simple calculus, signaling the center of the tail fin to sway just so its scaleless body might rise from the water to just the right apex of just the right parabola to fall, crash, really, from just the right center of evolution's gills, its dark tooth altar descending on the prayer of those tiny beating curtains, winged miracles, bright angels breathing breadcrumbs on the water. When the altar snaps shut and the fish church falls, crashing sated but down into gravity's baptism with a fierce thud toward the intimacy of under, where something unwinds in both predator and prey. Some pinwheel spins back toward an ancient wind, and the center opens wide, like a lotus inviting in the humble bee, only to reveal a subtler flower spinning and still.
Spinning and still. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm super interested in like the word center that keeps coming back, and it almost feels like that center is representing maybe the more oneness unity side, but then it's like you're kind of exploring all the edges of um what
Yeah.
emanates from that center.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole thing is, it's like, the predator prey relationship as sort of this archetypal version of the inevitability of suffering,
Yeah,
also like the surrendering possible into all the roles that need to be played out. And
exactly.
and in that, the stillness. you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I love that. I'm glad you read that. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's fun. I've been it's on my wall because I'm still working on it. And like
mm,
every time, so and it's fun. And then I've found this physicalized way to do editing. So it's not always on the computer. But
yeah.
in reading that, I heard something or like, oh, maybe that needs to get tweaked, you know,
Yeah.
which is fun.
Yeah. That's so funny how that works. Like if you write something and then you don't really read it out loud, and then you read it out loud and catch stuff that you didn't catch on the page. And then when you read or share it with somebody, like I know for me, if I share something with somebody, I'm like seeing it through their eyes, and then that changes my whole perspective of it. And
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
so it's kind of fun how that works.
It kind of connects it back to the healing thing that reminds me because when I used to do the poetry readings with my friend Andrew, who also had like the qigong training, we would read each other our poems, and then we discovered that we could learn about editing through the body and through the reading, and that also that part of what can happen is that there's places in us that can't express the poem off the page. It's like sometimes we write about stuff that's our own stuff we're working through, so then to be able to read the poem honestly, you got to like clear some energy that's stuck inside yourself. So it ended up becoming its own form of doing healing work. Like the poem is the hands-on, you know.
Mm, mm.
um,
Yeah. Well, Brooking, this was super fun. We could talk about this sort of stuff for, for a long, long time, and we will. The conversation will continue. But I think you were actually my first guest that I had on this podcast. Maybe I might be remembering that
is this the
incorrectly,
same one?
but yeah, this is Infinite Weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure you were the first guest. So, it was time to circle back around. So thank you, Brooking.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.